Thank you, everyone, for subscribing to Infinitely Productions. Before we introduce our next guest, we want to give you a little bit of background information. If you're from the Philadelphia area, this man is a legend. He has been working for the Philadelphia Inquirer for many years. Many people consider him to be a mafia expert. He's respected amongst his community, especially in terms of organized crime telling, journalism, and he's been reported on 60 Minutes. You may also recognize him from Fox 29's YouTube channel, The Mob Talk, with David Stratweiser. He has made many books. One of them he is very famous for is The Blood and Honor Inside the Scarfo Mob, to his Dr. Dealer, the 2020 edition, not to be mistaken for the Mark Bowden book. This one is published in 2020, labeled as Dr. Dealer. Please give a warm welcome to our special guest. Please give a warm welcome to our special guest, Mr. George Anastasia.
Good to be here. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you. So I just have some questions I'd like to ask you too. And I've also, like, since we've been corresponding since yesterday about former mob capo, Mr. Michael Franzese. Did you get a chance to see the video about the 5 myths?
Yeah, I saw that. I wasn't aware of that, but you sent me the link and I watched it yesterday. Yeah.
And I just want to go ahead.
There's so much misinformation. You know, there's misinformation about everything online, but there's so much misinformation about my former life. And he goes on to quote, informants told him this and that. Listen, I'm going to tell you this right now. Informants lie. A lot of the times they get up there and what they say is self-serving. They try to ingratiate themselves with the government. Not all of them and not everything they say, but come on. Hey everyone, welcome to another sit down with Michael Franzese. Hope everybody is doing well. All is very good and blessed on this end. And as always, I give all the praise, honor, and glory to my Lord and Savior for that. What are we going to do? You know, some things drive me a little bit crazy. And when it comes to people talking about mafia, Cosa Nostra, and they just get things wrong, but they speak with such authority, like they know what they're talking about. And a lot of so-called experts, I think you're guilty of that. Now, they're not going to admit it, and people don't know. I mean, what do you know? But there are a lot of people out there, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube that's just inaccurate. It's just not true. Not about anyone in particular. I'm talking about the operation of Cosa Nostra Mafia in this country in general. And I was reading an article, and it got to me a little bit. When I say got to me, I say, here we go again, by an expert. And I have nothing against this guy, and I'm sure he has credentials, and he studied the life, and he knows it fairly well, but he still gets things wrong. And he's a reporter. His name is George Anastasia. I believe he worked in Philadelphia for many years. He covered the organized crime and the mob. He was a reporter for, I think, the Inquirer, one of those papers there. He wrote a couple of books, and I understand they were very good. So again, I'm not knocking him as a whole, but this article that I read and that he wrote and he talked about were 5 myths of the mafia, that he claimed were 5 myths of the mafia. So I read it. So for him to say that this is a myth, he just made this up. The mafia never interacts with other organized crime groups. Where did he get that from? Is that stated anywhere? Did anybody say that? No. So I don't know why he just called it a myth when it really isn't a myth. So as far as I'm concerned, he made 5 mafia myths here, and not one of them are right. And the reason I'm saying this, people, again, there's so much misinformation. There's misinformation about everything online.
Go ahead.
I I was not aware. Here's my take on that. I think, you know, Mike Franzese does a podcast, and he needs content. And I think he found that Washington Post article and decided he could do 20-minute riff on it. And that's what he did. I don't want to get into a big debate about this. I think it's a question of semantics. And I think he misconstrues the meaning of the word myth. I mean, just one example. A myth is a perceived truth that isn't true anymore. That's what a myth is. And well, one example, um, the mob making ceremony is a secret ceremony. That's a myth. It's a myth now because the government's recorded 4 different ceremonies. Mob members have testified. So it's not a secret anymore. So, while it may have been a one time a secret ceremony, and technically speaking, if you're getting made, it's still a secret ceremony. There's nothing secret about it. And, I mean, we can quibble back and forth about what a myth means. Omerta, the code of silence, that's a myth. He took issue with that. It's not a myth, he's saying. Well, there have been so many guys who took the oath and subsequently became government informants and government witnesses that it is a myth. Or the code of silence, it doesn't apply anymore. So we can go on and on and on and pick apart each one of those 5 myths that he took issue with. I think it's a question of semantics, his interpretation of what a myth means, as opposed to what I believe a myth means. And, we can disagree.
Okay. I just wanted to summarize all that too, so we don't have to go over each and every one because, of course, we just wanted to summarize everything. Well, thank you for answering that question. Now, I just had questions about like the work that you currently do. Like, are you still doing more mob talks or doing any more podcasts?
Yeah, I'm doing it with Dave Schratweiser, the former reporter for Channel 29. He and I are both retired. We used to do a segment called Mob Talk for Fox 29. Now we do something on, it's called mobtalksitdown.com. It's on YouTube. And we do, every other week, every month, we do a report on the status of what's going on in the Philadelphia underworld and beyond. So, we're trying to keep current and keep up to date. And quite frankly, what's happened in the last 4 or 5 months is we've had to drift far afield from Philadelphia. There just isn't that much going on anymore in the Philadelphia underworld in terms of organized crime. So
Really?
we talk about New York, we talk about different parts of the country, what else is happening. Philadelphia mob is still out there, but it's not anywhere near what it used to be even 10 years ago. And I mentioned this before when I talk to people. I retired from the Inquirer 10 years ago. 10 years ago this month, in fact. But the last couple of years at the Inquirer, I probably spent more time writing about drug gangs, Black and Hispanic drug gangs, than I did about the Mafia, Cosa Nostra, because those were the gangs that were having an impact on the city. But the mob was no longer the dominant player in the underworld. And the drug underworld was certainly much more violent. And what was going on in the drug underworld was having a greater impact on society in general. So I spent more time writing about and reporting on that than Cosa Nostra at the end of my career at the Inquirer.
Speaking of that, since you like brought on like about Black and Hispanic, since you have done a lot on the La Cosa Nostra, especially the ones that occurred in South Philadelphia during the Philly mob era, have you ever done anything more like on the Black Mafia, or some people dispute about the Black Mafia's existence?
I wrote several stories about the Junior Black Mafia when they were in play for a while. But separate and apart from that, I mean, the major stories I did at the end of my career were about a drug dealer in North Philly named Kabani Savage, probably more violent than any mob boss I ever wrote about, and a really entrepreneurial drug operator in Southwest Philly named Alton Coles, nicknamed Ace Capone. And he had a major cocaine and crack network. And writing about those guys was not unlike writing about Angelo Bruno, Nicky Scarfer in their heyday. It was what I found in writing about it was neither law enforcement nor the public had the same perception of who those guys were, as opposed, everybody knew who Angelo Bruno was. Everybody knew who Nicky Scarfer was. Writing about Alton Coles, writing about Kabani Savage, it was like I was introducing those characters to the public. If you get the point I'm making, is we tended to overlook major players in the underworld. And I wondered if that was systemic racism on our part, or just it was much easier. Everybody had a frame of reference when you're talking about the mafia. Everybody has a, they know the movies, they know all the backstory. These were drug gangs. So if you look, Alton Coles, Kabani Savage, tremendous impact on the city, a lot of violence, and they didn't get the attention, the consistent attention that the mafia did.
Understood.
Yeah.
And I might get back on that subject a little bit, but since you mentioned Angelo Bruno, I want to be the precursor to that. Have you ever did any stories on the so-called first one, Salvatore Sabella?
No, I mean, that all obviously predated when I was a reporter for the Inquirer. My jumping off point in terms of writing about this was I was a reporter at the Inquirer in the late 1970s. The Inquirer sent me to Atlantic City to cover the start of the casino gambling era. And this is 1976. And the debate back then was legalized gaming going to bring the mob to Atlantic City? The answer was the mob already was in Atlantic City, but it became part of what I was writing about. And so my jumping off point in terms of writing about organized crime, writing about the Philadelphia crime family, began in the 70s, which was the end of the Bruno era. And then from there going forward. Didn't do much at all in terms of an historic look back at this. Newspapers don't do that very often anyway.
Unfortunately, I feel like the newspapers are going to the obituaries, but I gotta appreciate, because after all, that's how you got your start. I think you mentioned this because we both came from CCP, and you mentioned that what got you into journalism was that your father brought a newspaper every day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's when you're a reporter, you go where the story takes you, and I was fortunate to work at the Inquirer at a time when we had a lot of resources, we had a big staff. There was a lot of money, and reporters were able to develop beats. I mean, I don't know that anybody could do what we did at the Inquirer in the 70s. I don't know anybody could do that again today, because people don't realize reporting is labor intensive. Good reporting is labor intensive. And you have to have the luxury of being able to say, nah, the story's not there yet. I need a couple more days. I need another week. Given the way the news cycle is today, it's a 24/7 news cycle. And given the lack of staff, the diminishing staff, the lack of resources, much more difficult to develop a beat and to become something of an expert on any given topic. Whereas back in my day, it was a lot of guys were able to develop an expertise in a given field, not just organized crime, politics, education, whatever. You got to be able to take the time to get into it, and you can't do that if you're stretched very thin. And I think, unfortunately, most newspapers, the staff is stretched very thin right now.
Understood. Now, I was just curious, because I remember before that you had disputes about some of the monikers, like Angelo Bruno being called the docile John or the gentle Don, because I've heard certain different stories. Some say here in the moniker because he didn't whack Antonio Polina, even though that's been one of the big disputes, because I think when Bruno was rising in the criminal underworld, Antonio Polina was trying to get him executed, but instead Bruno caught wind of it and therefore say, okay, let's not kill him because that's going to cause beef within the families. So
I think Bruno was called the docile Don only because of what came after him. The Nicky Scarfo, the violence that came after Bruno was killed. Bruno was a boss for 21 years. People were killed during the Bruno era, but Bruno was also a mafia diplomat. Bruno recognized that the important thing was make money, not make headlines. So murder was kind of a negotiating tool of last resort. If everything else failed, somebody might get whacked. Scarfo comes along, and anybody screws up, they're getting whacked. It changed the whole dynamic. So Bruno became known as the docile Don, I think, almost posthumously, because of who came after him in terms of the violence that was let loose after Bruno was killed. The gentle Don, the docile Don, I think is almost a misnomer. All these guys, all these mob bosses use violence as a tool. It's just Scarfo seemed to enjoy it. And that was, it was like if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's that kind of thing with Scarfo. Violence was all he knew, and anything that happened, he resorted to violence to resolve the problem. Whereas Bruno would negotiate, Bruno would talk to guys, Bruno would work out compromises. You saw none of that in the Scarpa era. That's why I think Bruno was known as the docile Don. And historically, there was situations where, you know, at one point, I think a couple guys, he opted not to resort to violence, but to put him on the shelf, so to speak. And that contributed to his reputation.
Have you ever, because I noticed you like did reports on his assassination in front of his house. Have you ever met like any of his relatives or anything that matter?
Now, I talked to his daughter a couple times, but it was difficult to, she was a difficult person to talk to. Nah, I don't, you know, I talked to Bruno casually a couple times before he was killed, but he would
Oh,
never say very much of anything.
oh wow, you met the man himself.
Well, yeah, you know, he was coming out of a hearing and, you know, was kind of a no comment. He was always polite. Some of these other guys would just blow you off. He was polite, but never would say anything. And you know what else? It was a different era, though. Bruno wouldn't think of like sitting down and talking to a reporter.
Of course, that was very
20,
taboo.
30 years later, Joey Molino is running around South Philly, and you can go meet him for a drink, have a cup of coffee with him. So it was a different generation of wise guys. And I think I was fortunate that I was working the beat at a time when the younger generation came into power, and I had access to a lot of guys. Would have never had that access during the Bruno era. But 20 years later, I had guys' phone numbers, like their cell phones. I had emails, you know.
Wow.
I can talk to guys. It was a different set of circumstances.
Gotcha. And then I keep hearing, because I don't hear disputes about Antonio Bananas Capernegro being his executioner, because I think Philip Leonetti said that in Mafia Prince, the fall of La Cosa Nostra. But I'm just curious, like, has there ever been like case closes for some of these members, or is always?
I mean, what happened was, I think Capernegro, in fact, he might have even been the shooter that night. Or some people say he was the actual gunman with the shotgun. What happened in the aftermath of the Bruno murder was those guys turned up dead. Capernegro turned up dead. Salerno turned up dead. Frankie Sindone turned up dead. So, you know, the Mafia Commission was carrying out street level justice. You know, killing a boss was a major offense, and there always was a price to pay. And it wasn't, if you think about it, what it was the hierarchy of organized crime looking out for one another and watching their back. You know, you don't want to have a boss killed and the guys that do will walk away, because you may be the next boss that's killed. So there had to be retribution, and that certainly happened quickly in the Bruno assassination. Those guys all turned up dead, with the exception of John Stamper, who went on the run and later surfaced as a boss.
And I'm about to get Stamper soon. I'm sorry. Do you mind if I fix my mic? It's been flickering a little bit. Thank you. That looks better.
That's good. All right.
Okay. Sorry about that. I hate when that type of issue happens. Okay. And then I'm speaking of Frank Sindone, because I don't hear too much about him. Like, was Frank the Barracuda Sindone, like, why did he even get that moniker? Because he was a loan shark, and he gets
I think it was because it was a loan shark. Again, he's a guy who was on the scene when I started writing about these guys, but he exited rather quickly in the aftermath of the Bruno thing. He was, I mean, from everything I was able to determine, he was a big moneymaker. And he was one of these guys, I think, who was frustrated with Bruno's laissez-faire leadership. I mean, there were a couple tapes where he and some other guys are complaining about, you know, and the other thing is, it always comes down to money with these guys. It's always about money. And there were guys who were complaining that Bruno had more money than God, and consequently Bruno didn't care that they were not making as much money as they could be making. So Atlantic City's coming, fine, let everybody go into Atlantic City. New York wants to come in, that's fine, is enough for everybody. You know, share the wealth kind of thing. Those guys who were Philadelphia guys were a little upset at that. You know, they thought Atlantic City should have been entirely theirs because it always had been. And now all of a sudden Atlantic City gets casino gambling and it's worth more. And Bruno's saying, nah, New York wants to come in, Chicago wants to come in, there's enough for everybody. They saw that as, you know, he had all his money socked away, and we got an opportunity here, and he's letting it pass. So, you know, you hear and you talk again and again about the mafia, men of honor, Cosa Nostra. Honor is a secondary thing. If there ever were men of honor, I think they disappeared 2 generations ago. This is a business, and it's about making money. and and when you're not making enough money, or when somebody's making money that you think you ought to be making, that's when the violence kicks in. You know,
Speaking of that, because I was always confused, do you think Bruno would have retired before being executed? Because, like, for example, Carl Gambino, who was like a guy who protected him at times, since he was one of the big crime family bosses, do you think he would have probably lived old age and probably retire, or you think he was too money hungry to even want to resign and let that go?
I think that Bruno was in a position where he could have retired. He had real estate in Florida. He had money, a steady
Oh,
cash flow
Florida.
stream coming in. And I think if the dynamic of Atlantic City hadn't come into play, it probably would have reached a point where he would have retired. But Atlantic City changed the game. Atlantic City upped the ante so many different ways. And because Bruno was laissez-faire and a lot of his guys saw an opportunity being lost, they turned on him. The other thing that gets lost all the time is the drug situation. You can make an argument that Bruno was killed because of drugs. And, Bruno had an edict, no drug dealing. He didn't want anybody in his organization dealing drugs. Tony Bananas, Caponegro up in Newark, was dealing heroin on the sly, sneaking. And some other guys as well, because there was money in drugs. And it's almost the irony is at the same time frame, we're talking like 1979, 1978, 1979, 1980. Rosario and Giuseppe Gambino from New York, Sicily by way of New York, open up a restaurant in Cherry Hill, New Jersey called Valentino's. It's a supper club. And Rosario and Giuseppe Gambino were part of the Sicilian heroin pizza connection international drug operation. And the perception from other members of the Bruno organized crime family was that Bruno let them set up shop in his territory, Cherry Hill, right across the river from Philadelphia. So here are these major drug dealers setting up business, and Bruno's okay with that. But we, Bruno's guys, can't get on that gravy train. And then supposedly Bruno invited the Gambino brothers to his home for dinner, Easter Sunday that year.
Yeah, I do remember you talking about that.
It's a great honor to be invited to the boss's house for dinner. And Caponegro and the other guys in the organization are saying to themselves, these two guys are going to dinner at Bruno's house. They're bringing an envelope with money in it to pay tribute to the boss. I know that's drug money. They know it's drug money, and Bruno knows it's drug money. But Bruno's going to take that money. So even though Bruno's got this edict, no dealing drugs, he's accepting drug money from two major international drug dealers, and he's letting them set up shop in Philadelphia, so to speak. So that was another reason I think Caponegro and some of the guys decided, Bruno was a hypocrite. Bruno said, don't worry about Atlantic City. Everybody can come in. That's bull. It should have been our city. And now he's saying, don't deal drugs. And here are the Gambinos coming right into our territory. So I think all of those things factored into, and then, so Caponegro goes to New York and talks to, I guess, some people in the Genovese crime family, and they tell him, he's got the okay to do what he's got to do. Well, that was like a double cross. He thought he had the approval of the commission. Bruno gets killed. Caponegro gets summoned up to New York, think he's going to be crowned the new boss, and instead he's brutally beaten, choked, stabbed, $20 bill stuffed in his mouth and in his anus, and he's left I think a body bag in the trunk of a car in the Bronx. That's the message, killed the boss, and you got greedy, you killed the boss. This is what happens to you. So
and they did the same thing to his brother-in-law.
Yeah, it was a double cross, and Caponegro's off the scene, and those events, the Bruno murder and the subsequent murders of the 3 or 4 guys involved, set the Philadelphia mob family careening out of control, and it never was able to stabilize again after that. And ultimately, within a year, Phil Testa's killed, and then Nicky Scarfo takes over, and Scarfo was a psychopath. And then it just keeps careening out of control, more and more violent. And, from a selfish perspective, I'm right there now. Now I'm watching this major development in an organized crime family, this mob war. And I'm able to develop a beat. I benefited from that in terms of career-wise, but it was from the Philadelphia mob perspective, it was the beginning of the end. They've never been as stable and never been as powerful as they were during the Bruno era.
Right. For that, I need to get your autograph. Blood and I was like one of my first books I read as a teenager.
Oh, thank you.
So
Yeah, that was the first one I did, and it was, I think it captured the essence of what was going on then. Yeah.
yes, indeed. Especially looking at it from a journalistic point of view, and then when Prince Bobby comes, since they're seeing a member from the culture, so they can indulge a little bit more differently.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of Testa, who's Bruno's successor, to those who don't know, when it came to like Philip Chicken Man Testa, he only been reigning for like about a year, and he's named the Bruce Springsteen song. But I was just curious, have you ever interacted with him or Salvi Testa, his son?
No, never had any direct contact with them. I mean, I wrote about the Testa murder, and then I wrote a lot about the whole machinations with Salvi Testa. But as I said, these guys were not anxious to be interviewed.
Of course.
Care about the press,
especially in those days.
Yeah, I mean, and it changed with the next generation, with the Joey Marino generation. And I think about, why was that? Why do you think that was? Well, Testa, Scarfo, Bruno, they came from a different era, and the press was, they were an annoyance, something to be tolerated. They're always going to be there, but just ignore them. And that was the attitude. The next generation of guys, the Joe and Marino generation, those guys, I believe this, most of those guys, it wasn't really about Cosa Nostra. It wasn't really about the mafia. They came from the same neighborhood. They hung in the same street corner. And their loyalty was to one another from the neighborhood. It was a neighborhood thing, not a mafia thing. They were street corner guys. And if you look at the Marino organization as it was, most of those guys grew up together, and none of them, maybe one, most have not cooperated. The other thing is, if they have that street corner mentality, you don't want anybody else to get the last word.
True.
So a couple of guys started to realize, if I talk to the press and I put my spin on events, I'm going to be able to get over on these other guys that are saying stuff about me. And when I first started writing about this, I got complaints from, he only writes what the cops tell him. He only writes what the prosecutors say. And I said to somebody, you know what? I'm only as good as the people I'm talking to. Only as good as the information I got. Now, if they want to, if they got something to say, tell them. So one guy calls me and he starts out ranting and raving about what I'm just saying to you. I only write what the cops tell me. I don't know half of what, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And I say, well, it's ironic you're calling me right now. I'm working on this story. And I forget what it was, but I said, cops are telling me ABC. And he said, it's XYZ. So I check it out, and he might be right. I write a story in the paper, according to law enforcement sources, ABC, but however, according to one underworld source, it might be XYZ. And they saw that in the paper, and it was like a light went off. And they realized they could, like a politician, you could have your spin. You could get your word out to the public. Now, Bruno and those guys, they didn't care about getting their word out to the public. They didn't care. But these younger guys, it was that street corner thing. Who's getting over on who? Who's going to have the last word? And they saw the media as a way to play that game. And so we in the media benefited from that, but we also, I think, in retrospect, we probably somewhat enhanced their reputation, their status, their glamour by writing about them. But it was a two-way street.
It's an interesting paradigm.
They saw a need to talk about what was going on, whereas Bruno saw no need to do. What does he care what I'm writing? He wouldn't care what I was writing. I'm not going to have any impact on him. But these younger guys, they wanted their word out there. They wanted to be, you say this, well, here's the truth, boom, to you. It's like that kind of stuff,
Yes, speaking of that,
different.
And this is why I get confused, especially even though he was still young and he's still a different generation. Sal, because you mentioned about his killings, because I was always confused. How come he never been arrested for the associations with Rocco Marinucci, Frank Chicky Narducci, and others in that realm? How come he's never been arrested when he was probably the most easy suspect to determine after his father's assassination?
I think you're right. I mean, Salvi Testa was certainly a target of an investigation when Narducci was killed and when all that stuff was going on. But if you have to also remember, this predated um, any cooperators in the Philadelphia crime family. And I think Testa's, if Testa had not been killed, he probably would end up being indicted. Because when guys flipped, they would have certainly given up Testa as well. But Testa's murder, ironically, I mean, I think Testa's murder is one of the things that convinced a guy like Nick Caramandi that you screw up with Scarfo, there's no alternative. You've got to go cooperate or you're going to get killed. I mean,
Right.
that
Didn't
was
he?
the message that the murder of Salvi Testa sent that message out. And I think Tommy Del Giorno and Nick Caramandi, the two major cooperators in the Scarfo era, got that message loud and clear. And when they ran afoul of Scarfo and they knew what had happened to Salvi, you know, Salvi was Phil Testa's son. Phil Testa basically made Scarfo. Scarfo had been banished to Atlantic City. When Testa took over, he made Scarfo the consigliere of the family. So Scarfo was obligated to Phil Testa. Yet Scarfo killed Salvi Testa.
His own godson.
Paranoia. You know, Salvi was this charismatic, young, good-looking gangster. Probably everything Scarfo wished he could have been, but wasn't. And Scarfo began to see Salvi Testa as a rival, where in fact I don't think he was. I think Salvi Testa was perfectly content to be the capo in Philadelphia and to work for Scarfo. Scarfo couldn't cope with it.
Yeah, speaking of that, because I've also his girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, wrote a book about their relationship. Have you ever read about it?
Now I've talked to, if it's the same woman we're talking about, I've talked to a couple of women who had relationships with Salvi, and nothing but praise for the guy as a very, very intelligent, charismatic, good-looking guy, handsome guy. Um, on the other hand, I mean, Nick Caramandi would say Salvi Testa grew up in that life, knew the way of Cosa Nostra inside and out, and knew what it was all about, and knew that violence was a part of it. And that's one of the reasons Testa was able to survive for almost a year while they were plotting to kill him, because he knew the ins and outs. But ultimately, it caught up to him. Yeah.
Did Nick Caramandi witness him being killed?
No, Nick Caramandi disposed of his body. Nick Caramandi knew how it went down in the candy store, and Nick Caramandi's job was to take the body and dump it in Jersey, which
Gotcha.
what he and a couple other guys did. I mean, he knew it was going down. He knew all the different times they tried to set Salvi up. And I'm like I said, I think one of the big reasons Caramandi flipped was when he got jammed up and he thought he had pissed Scarfo off. He knew what had happened to Salvi Testa, and he's saying to himself, if he can do that to Salvi, he's going to do it to anybody, and I'm the next target. And so they flipped.
Now, I hear different speculations about this before Savvy Tauster was killed and before his downfall. Is that when he owned like businesses in Atlantic City, and then one of those businesses was sold to Donald Trump? Is that true, or because I hear like different
They had
articles?
a piece of real estate. It was Salvi and I think one of the Norducci boys. They had it was a corner. It was I want to say it was called the Bistro. I forget. It was on a corner, Pacific and Missouri, I think. It was a key piece of property that Trump needed to complete the block where he was building his casino and his parking garage. I think it was the block where the parking garage was. And so they sold it. They bought it for X and sold it for Y. It made a lot of money on the deal. And people point to that and they say, look, Trump is in with the mob. Look at this deal. Everybody down there was getting ripped off. It was a big monopoly game. And while there's a lot of reasons to believe Trump had nefarious connections, I don't think that particular deal was one of them. I mean, everybody in Atlantic City was playing monopoly back then, and Testa and Narducci were shrewd. They had a valuable piece of property, and they made a lot of money on the deal.
Who was getting ripped off? Was it Trump or the mafia members? Because some say that one made better than the other, and I get confused to who was the one that won the fair game in the finance world.
In that particular financial deal?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think that's what the market was. Everybody, land speculation was rampant down there. I did a whole big series about that. It was everybody was playing monopoly, and if you had the right piece of property in the right block, you could hold out for as much money as you wanted, and you would probably get it, because those casinos were in a rush to get built and get open. Financial reality disappeared. So, to say that one case is an example of Trump and the mob, I think, is a bit of a stretch.
Oh, I'm not saying that either, because it also, when it came to the union members, you had no choice but to do business with the mob. It's not like you
Right.
like there was like holding picket signs to say where the mob buy from us. It's like that was just like indirectly, that's how the service was.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's funny because I've talked about this before, and it's somewhat ironic. I mean, Trump would say, he's being tarred with a broad strokes of a brush by saying he was mob connected because he bought that piece of land from two mobsters when everybody down there was doing it. And the irony is, it would be kind of like somebody would stand up and say, all Mexican immigrants are drug dealers, all Muslims are terrorists. Who would say that? I mean, that's Trump's a master at that kind of crap, turning things around on people. But yeah, I mean, he had a lot of crazy connections, probably make a better case in New York than Atlantic City in terms of his dealings with the mob. But that particular case involving that particular piece of real estate, the mob guys made a killing, but a lot of guys were making a killing in real estate. And I don't think you can read too much more into it than that.
Gotcha. And then Frank Chicky Narducci, before he was killed, wasn't he supposed to go to possibly might get indicted for those RICO charges?
I think a lot of them were, yeah. I think there was a big RICO case coming down, and Narducci would have been in that case, but he was killed. Yeah, I mean, Bruno would have probably been in the case too, but he was killed and tested. The first big RICO case turned out to be not so big because the guys that were going to be targeted ended up dead.
What about Rocco Marinucci? Because I never heard too much about him other than him being the person that hit the detonator. Is that correct?
I mean, that's always been the speculation that he was the guy who was in the van across the street, pushed the button, and the reason people think that is, well, one, a lot of underworld sources were saying that, but two was, I think a year later he's found with a firecracker stuffed in his mouth, killed. I mean, that was Salvi Testa taking revenge on what happened to his father. So, yeah, I mean, you think about that. I mean, the stuff that was going on back then was the stuff of movies and novels. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
No one ever made a movie about that.
Yeah, you couldn't make it up any better. That kind of stuff. When Marinucci blows up Phil Testa, and then a year later he's killed and there's firecrackers stuffed in his mouth.
Same day.
What does that say? Phil Testa's killed on the Ides of March. I mean, this was so much symbolism.
March Madness for the mob, their birthdays and the days.
So much craziness back then, and it was a fascinating era. And I was, as I said earlier, I was fortunate to be working for a newspaper that had a lot of resources, and they just said, go cover it, go do what you got to do. And
now, speaking of like the Scarpa era and all the violence thing that he's like associated with, his nephew Philip Leonetti, who still does interviews even with Value Entertainment, who still keeps himself discreet. Have you got a chance to actually see him since you've been in the same documentaries as him before?
I've talked to Phil a couple of times, and in fact, at one point he and I were talking about doing a book, but it didn't work out. He subsequently did a book with someone else. Phil Leonetti was a very intelligent guy and a very, very good witness, probably one of the best witnesses. And I think I know a little bit about where he is now, and he's also one of the few guys to turn his life around. He's got a legitimate business. If people who are his associates now have no idea who he was. I mean, he's been able to make that transition. A lot of guys can't do that. A lot of guys like Nick Caramondi, a guy I know very well and wrote about. Nick has never been able to adjust to life after the mob.
Is he still alive, or?
He's alive. He's living in Middle America. That's all. I mean, he's living in a trailer park. I mean, if he could turn it around and go back to where he was as a wise guy, he'd do it in a minute. That was the high point of his life. But so yeah, he's an example of somebody who wasn't able to make it. Whereas Leonetti was smart, intelligent. It didn't hurt. Supposedly Leonetti and his mother made off with a couple $1 million when they flipped.
Really? And I was just not too far at the Atlantic Cemetery that I've actually did some research about the Yankees, and I said, oh my goodness, the Scarfo family burials there.
I mean, again, is this a myth? Is this folklore? Is it true? Supposedly, Scarfo had anywhere from $1 to $3 million stashed in his house in Atlantic City. And when Leonetti flipped, his mother, Nancy, was Scarfo's sister, was able to get into the house and get the money before they disappeared into WITSEC, the Witness Security Program. That's always
Now,
the story. Yeah.
but I'm just curious though, especially since this is during the time when he was like, by the time you're starting writing Philadelphia Inquirer, I think he had like his first two killings by the time. First was Louis DeMarco, which I don't really hear very often because the most famous one is Vincent Falcone. I'm surprised no one doesn't bring up Louis DeMarco. Is there any like source about him besides him being killed and like I think Atlantic City or Philly
No,
Street?
I mean, that was one of those things that happens, and it didn't get a lot of attention at the time, and then nobody went back on it. Falcone certainly was a big one, and everybody wrote about it, and everybody knew about it. Yeah, there's a whole, I mean, Phil was, I mean, he was at one time when he was testifying, a defense attorney was saying, trying to say to him, you're ruthless. You're a ruthless killer. You killed 10 people. And Leonetti, he looks at the guy and said, I don't think I was ruthless. I mean, that's just what we did. That's who we were. Yeah, 10 murders. I mean, think about it. 10 murders, and he ended up doing 5 years, 5 months, and 5 days.
An interesting five count. I remember hear about that when they did this ABC Report News.
Yeah, I mean, it's the trade-off that the government was making back then. You make a trade-off to get the conviction of the bigger guy. In New York, they made the trade-off with Sammy the Bull Gravano in order to get God. The only place, Kerry, that did not happen that way. In Philadelphia, the government made a deal with the boss, Ralph Natale, in order to make a case against the underboss, Joey Marino. The only time I've ever seen that happening. And it was a bad deal. Natale was, in street terminology, Natale was a bullshit artist. He told a lot of stories.
He just passed away this year.
Yeah, couldn't back them up. And he wasn't a good witness at all. But the government made the deal. They were so enamored of, we're going to flip a mob boss and get him to cooperate. And it was number one, flipping a mob boss. Number two, Marino had become the face of the Philadelphia mob. Marino had the Christmas parties for the homeless and was really under the skin of the FBI in Philadelphia. He was the celebrity gangster. He was the John Gotti of Passion Avenue. So the government made a choice, and they made a deal with, I think it was a terrible deal, a deal with Natale to get Marino. Only time I think it's ever happened. You make a deal with the boss to get the underboss. Whereas in these other cases, Gravano to get Gotti, you always you work your way up the ladder.
Gotcha. Man, it's funny that you mentioned that because I almost forgot about mentioning about Ralph Natale, especially since his recent passing. He's done an interview where he was very heated to talk about Scarfo Leonetti. And here's another interesting paradigm I get confused. Notice when we brought up Falcone and the Scarfo family, they're both buried in Atlantic City, yet the killer's family's buried there, yet his victim is there in the cemetery. And then Angelo Bruno, Rocco Marinucci, the Tessa family, all the Holy Cross cemetery. So how ironic is that you got all the bosses, underbosses, killers, and victims all in the same area? It's just wow.
Yeah, that's the marvel. It's marble. It's everybody's got their mausoleum, or they got their headstone, and you walk through, you see the names, and if you know the connections, it's ironic and fascinating. But it is what it is.
It is so funny because also my next door neighbor, who's Italian, actually, it's so funny when people think of Italian culture, some may negatively think of the mafia, whereas though for my upbringing, it was more of the Renaissance era, like Da Vinci and Michelangelo.
Sure.
Because I grew up appreciating Italian culture because of my next door neighbor, and I did not know this until she passed away the day of that. She was 99 years old, and she used to always joke. She said, "Us Sicilians and Romans, we live a long time. We don't die."
That's it.
And then my middle name is Antonio. She used to say, "Mangia Antonio, mange." Or any food or cooking recipe. And then, I mean, are you both of Sicilian heritage?
Yeah, my grandparents came from Sicily. On my mother's side, they came from around Palermo, and on my father's side, they came from the province of Messina. I didn't know any. My grandparents were all passed away by the time I was a kid, so I never knew any of them.
Do you speak Italian? Because I know you speak English or French, but
I'm self-taught. I can speak a little bit of Italian, but I didn't grow up in that culture where there were older people in the home speaking Italian. Uh, my father was first generation, so I was second generation. My father was the youngest of seven and the only one in his family to graduate from high school. He had three kids, all three of them have college degrees, and his two oldest grandkids, my daughters, have master's degrees. That's the Italian American experience. I mean, that's what it's about. That's the immigrant experience. I mean, all of this stuff about immigrants today, it bothers me a lot because you see somebody like DeSantis in Florida, who's Italian American, and no doubt tracing his roots. There had to be an immigrant coming over at some point to get him and his family here. And now, to turn on the immigrants, it just bothers me. You forget where you came from. I mean, what I just said about my dad, me, my brother and sister, that's the experience. That's the immigrant experience. He was a high school graduate. I'm a college graduate. My daughters have master's degrees. It's America. It's what it's about. And we lose sight of that. And, the mafia, people get enamored of the mafia, and it's the mafia, Cosa Nostra, has basically taken the values of the Italian American experience, honor, family, and loyalty, and bastardized it to their own ends to justify who they are and what they did. But by and large, I mean, 99% of the Italian American experience in America is not Cosa Nostra. And I get criticized sometimes because of that, but I rather.
It's part of history. It's like how some Italians like to be associated with Columbus Day because he said, an Italian discovered America. Even though it's been one of the biggest myths in our curriculum, and unfortunately, it's not true. But I said, but also do Italians want to be associated with a guy who's known for doing like mass killings either? So it's just one of those interesting complexes.
Yeah, I mean, and if I've done a little bit of research about the whole Columbus Day, how it evolved. And the way it evolved, this is, I think, 1892. I think the president was a guy named Rutherford. And a lot of people don't know this. In 1891 in New Orleans, there was a mass lynching of Sicilians. They were suspected of having killed the sheriff. And the townspeople broke into the jail and strung up these Sicilian immigrants. And there was a great hue and cry. Italy was going to recall their ambassador to the United States. And I think the president was Rutherford, wanted to do something to placate the Italian government. And they're looking around for what can we do? And he said, oh, let's have a Columbus Day parade. That's where the origin of it was. Because Columbus did a lot of terrible things. There's no doubt about that historically. But, it was, again, it's politics. It was create a situation to placate a voting bloc. And it all stemmed from this terrible lynching in New Orleans. We can argue back and forth about the values of Columbus and what he did and what he didn't do. But a lot of people don't know the origin of Columbus Day had very little to do with anything except politics. They could have picked somebody else, Rutherford and his administration. They ended up picking Columbus because it was convenient.
And it's so funny. We're in the month of October, on the month of Columbus Day, or Native American Day for some people. And I also thank you for being like these proper journalists that still tell these stories that some people don't really hear because we get caught up in the mythology of it all.
Exactly.
Now all of a sudden the truth gets lost.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think too many people want everything to be black or white, and it's not. There's a lot of gray, and you got to recognize that. You got to recognize that there's the multifaceted layers to a story. And before you stake out your position, you should try to figure out what the different factors are.
Now, speaking of position, especially since I know that you wrote a book during 2020, do you have any other more material that's coming out, or do you want to discuss your book or other material that you have planned on doing in your future?
What I've been doing more recently, and I'm having fun doing it, although I'm not haven't hit a home run. I'm writing some scripts for movies and TV, and I'm enjoying it, but I just haven't. It hasn't connected yet, but I find that it's a different kind of writing, and it's fascinating, and I enjoy it. But we'll see what happens. I mean, I've written, I think, 6 or 7 books. It takes a lot of work, and I don't think I have that energy anymore as I'm aging. But
both of us are authors.
Yeah, writing scripts is a lot of fun, and I'm hoping I can do something with that. We'll see. Nobody's done a good movie about the Philadelphia Mob. And it's
Irishman was the closest we had, and that wasn't, a Goodfellas level, but it's still a good movie.
which was that?
The Irishman by Martin Scorsese.
The Irishman, right? And it had a Philadelphia component, although
Not them to Philly.
well, I don't believe it was a true story. I mean, I don't think Sheeran killed Hobbs.
No, in fact, many people dispute that. Not only Michael Franzese and other mafia people, but also even certain government affiliates as well have disputed that. It's just, since he was dying of cancer at the time, and then was trying to get a publisher agent. Therefore, it's easy to convince people to sell his story since he had certain history with mob affiliates from the Philadelphia mob. But still, even when it came to Joe Gallo's killing and Jimmy Hoffa, that's always been disputed.
And this will be sacrilegious, but if that had been Scorsese's first mob movie, it wouldn't have been as well received as it was. I think it was when they said we're doing The Irishman, it was like, we're getting the gang back together. Here's De Niro, here's Pesci, but it's going to be the last go round. Scorsese made a lot of great mob movies. I don't think The Irishman was one of them, but it benefited from being the last go round.
I just wish he would have got out with the bang, because I love Goodfellas, Casino, and so much other ones. Even if it's not mob related, there's Aviator. I even like Hugo, which has nothing to do with the mob, but it's still a good Scorsese film because it's still showing you this whole world building and his love of filmography.
Yeah, I mean, he's a genius, no doubt about it. But I'm of all the mob movies, I would not rank The Irishman in the top 10, any stretch of the imagination.
You mentioned one film that I actually did like to check out, because that's one mobster movie that doesn't get much love compared to The Godfather or Carlito's Way. The Friends of Eddie Coyle by George Anastasia.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a fun book with Glenn Macnow, The Ultimate Book of Gangster Movies, where we listed the 100 best, our estimation. And yeah, The Friends of Eddie Coyle and The Pope of Greenwich Village were my two favorite mob movies, even though neither one has gotten the kind of attention of other movies have. But yeah, Friends of Eddie Coyle is a great movie set in Boston, Robert Mitchum. Pope of Greenwich Village, Mickey Rourke, great movie.
Great actor too.
Yeah.
What about Donnie Brasco? Have you ever got a chance to meet the real person?
I don't think I ever was face to face. I've talked to Pistone a couple times, but never face to face. I think people don't appreciate what he did. 6 years undercover.
And it was not supposed to even be that long.
Exactly, yeah. And the pressure and the tension that creates, it was a phenomenal piece of work. And he could have it was only going to get made. That's how tight
it was almost close to almost executing someone, which is unfortunate. And then especially since he caused problems with his own family, and then who knew his life would actually be a movie. And the movie only summarizes to what we can only interpret. We can't comprehend all that.
Exactly. I mean, it was a phenomenal piece of police work, and I think it took a toll on him and his family and on a lot of different people. But I mean, it opened the window into the workings of organized crime that it's just continued since then. I mean, this is kind of come full circle. What we talk about what Franzese was talking about myth and reality. What we know today of organized crime, the Cosa Nostra, puts a lie to a lot of the glamour and the bravado that's part of it, but also the mythology, the men of honor, the omerta, the secret making ceremony. That doesn't exist anymore because everybody's given it all up. It's all out there, and we see it in movies now. I mean, every making ceremony you see in a mob movie is based on reality, is based on testimony that actual witnesses have given who were made members of the organization. Joe Valachi started it all back in '63. He's the first guy to say, it's not the mafia, it's Cosa Nostra. Let me say one other thing before we end, because this is just kind of a bugaboo of mine, and I teach a course on organized crime. I always say this. Valachi talked about Cosa Nostra, our thing, right? For some reason, the FBI loves three initials: FBI, IRS, DEA. They made it La Cosa Nostra. Have you ever seen any memos? It's always the LCN. Well, La Cosa Nostra in Italian is our thing. It makes no sense. But the FBI wants the three initials, and so we got LCN. You see that in all kind of government documents, but it's
Mhm.
Cosa Nostra.
One last person I do want to go before we wrap it up is Skinny Razor DeTulio. Are you familiar with him, or because I know
I,
there's so much newspapers about his story?
that's a name I heard a lot about, but again, it was before my time, and he's surfaced in The Irishman. I mean, he had a bar where they hung out a lot.
Because Ralph Natalia Hurd worked for him, and then the Friendly's Lounge is down
Right,
by.
that's Ralph claimed he worked for Skinny Razor. Skinny Razor was supposedly a legitimate, serious, tough guy and a legitimate gangster, but it was before my time. I didn't do anything with or about him.
Okay, well, I wish you, because also I do filmmaking and writing, so I wish you the best of luck. Like, do you feel comfortable sharing like what type of screenplays you're working on, or you want to
Well,
keep that pretty
there's a couple. One is based on the Penn's Landing extortion that brought down the Scarfo mob, and the other is the one piece of fiction I've ever written is called The Big Hustle. Long before American Hustle in that movie, The Big Hustle was a four-part series that appeared in the old Inquirer Sunday magazine, and I've written a script based on that. And it's kind of it's a caper movie. It's how best is it's kind of The Sopranos meets Moonstruck, or a Blue Collar Ocean's 11. It's set in Atlantic City, the dawn of casino gambling, and it all takes place in 1 week's time. So those are the two scripts I'm most happy with, and I'm hoping something happens with them. But it's a crapshoot. It's more a crapshoot than the book business. The movie business is crazy. I'm just hoping somebody says, you know what? Nobody's ever done justice to Philadelphia. Where can we find a good Philadelphia story? And then I'll raise my hand and say, here, take a look at this. Who knows?
Okay. Well, hey, I also do filmmaking myself, and then plus, if I know any people, hope we can probably put some connections together. But I want to thank you so much for taking your time on a very short notice. Hope I get a chance to meet you in person and then get your autographs for all the books that you made. I love reading all your literature and crime fiction. I mean, crime stories. Thank you so much, Mr. Anastasia. I wish you all the best.
No, it's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Have a good one now, and this wraps it up.
Okay.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel and check out more content. Feel free to give us your feedback and suggestions on who we should do next in the comments. This is Infinitely Productions. We love ya.